All right, what's happening at Bryan Insurance?
Well, there's a lot going on at Bryan Insurance as always, but today we're going to talk about auto insurance liability limits.
Yeah, the limits, because a lot of people are really confused on the limits when you get a policy and you get a limit. We started out talking, Sonia and I, about this earlier about who gets paid in a multi-car pilot, but it's kind of hard to discuss that if you don't understand the basic limits.
And so what liability coverage is if you're driving your vehicle and you hit another car, or you hit another object, or you hit a person, you cause injury, and so you're liable for their damages. So the liability limits, that's where that comes in. And we're not going to get into the nitty gritty because y'all will just all fall asleep. But there's two ways. So if you can either have split limits or single limits. So if you have split limits, your policy will say 50,000, 100,000, 50,000, and you're like, what does that even mean? Okay, so just briefly, those have to do with bodily injury and property damage per vehicle, per accident, or if it's just one limit, then you can just apply that whole limit to the accident.
Right, that's called a single combined limit. Those are my favorite.
Yeah, that's how we prefer to write them.
Yeah, it's so easy. You have one limit, you know what it is. Let's say you get a $300,000 limit. That is whatever you need it for
the accident, per accident. Yeah, but that's what that means. And so it's really important to understand, because if you just think of what we think of as the bodily injury, because that's really unlimited, that could be a terrible claim, but think about just the property damage. And we just talked about a limit that we see a lot, which is 50, 150, which ultimately means you have $50,000 of property damage. How many vehicles these days are worth more than $50,000? A lot.
The other
most all of them.
Yeah, what if you hit one vehicle into another one? Is that $50,000? No, you're not going to have enough insurance.
No. And not only that, the state minimum in Texas for property damage is
it 50? It's so low. We don't write it,
30,
so we
60, 25. It's 25,000.
Yeah, that's the state makes you.
So that is the minimum amount of property damage that people out in Texas have to drive is $25,000. That is not nearly enough to even cover a simple accident nowadays.
So your liability, we see it all the time. We see the court cases too that we read about. Nobody wants to have an accident and have their vehicle damaged, and that's a problem, and you're going to want to get it fixed, but you can put a dollar amount on that. Your vehicle is worth this much, and it's going to cost, you cause an injury to somebody, you could have a judgment against you that lasts forever. So the liability is so important, and it's important that you understand, and also just get a quote for higher limits. It really doesn't cost as much as you think.
It really doesn't.
And then Brad and I always talk about these interesting claims that somehow seem to always be Brad's claims.
Well, I just take after Dad's footsteps.
He does, yeah.
No, we're discussing a claim that happened in Wichita Falls where an old man pulled out in front of me and I hit him and sent him into a parking lot and hit a couple other vehicles, and it was interesting because his liability, I was first party, so he paid out to me first, and then all those other vehicles were in line, so the ones in the parking lot got paid second. So if he had bare minimums, he would have paid for my truck, and then whatever's left over would go to the second person he hit, and then whatever's left over from that would go to the third person.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that bare minimum of $25,000 got eaten up real quick.
I always say that those stories are interesting for our insurance nerd minds, unless they're real stories about people we know, because that's not interesting anymore if somebody doesn't have enough coverage or whatever. But it is interesting, and like I said, find out from your agent. What is my liability limit? And if they say something like 100, 300, 100, say, what does that even mean? Make them tell you what that means. I hope they wouldn't say that, but
right. Well, I would think the best thing to do is that when you do call your agent and ask that question, say, okay, is that enough to cover what I've got? And a lot of people, I think they just buy the insurance to get the card so they can get their license, and they don't look at the limits of what they are until they get into a wreck. And then you hear stuff like, like we've heard a million times, well, insurance is going to pay up on this, they're going to take care of everything, I got full coverage, blah, blah, blah.
There's no such thing as full coverage.
And then they come along, and then what happens is they get a check for $15 and they're stuck. And what do? Is because they didn't check their limits.
And I understand it. Everything is so expensive these days. If you just bought a car, you're paying probably a payment you weren't used to making, insurance on top of it. I get it. We pay insurance. It's horribly expensive right now. But just understand, no, don't wait to find out when there's nothing you can do about it.
At least y'all understand. That's what I like about Bryan Insurance Agency is they understand that they know insurance is high. So they try to work with you to help you.
Well, that's one of the main reasons why we've always stayed independent, because that way we can always make sure that we have the product for our customers.
Right.
And also, you know, when the market changes, we can be flexible and change with them. So we understand it all.
Yeah.
Well, you definitely, when it comes to interest, like everything else, you get what you pay for. And if you're going to go cheap, then you're going to get cheap. That's pretty easy.
Just sometimes, yeah. Just understand it before. That's our advice. I know I preach it all the time.
So I did have a question this morning.
Yeah, it was a really good question.
Yeah, Rick and I was talking, and Sonia answered it, but it's a good thing to put out on the radio. We were talking about in this cold weather, everybody starts their vehicle and leaves it running. Well, if you leave it running and the door's unlocked and somebody says, hey, there's a warm car, I'm fixing to take it, and they're gone, I'm like, well, does the insurance even pay for it?
Yeah, there is no exclusion on the, that would be under the, other than collision, or sometimes called comprehensive, and there's not an exclusion for, that would be considered theft.
There you go.
Because they stole it, you know, just because you left the key in it, yeah, I mean, so yeah, you know, nobody wants to get in that situation, but.
Like if you had like a company like the General or like Infinity or one of those.
There
might be something in there.
Your standard typical policies don't exclude that.
But your standard ones like the majors will not have something in there.
We see, you know, some of these companies that come by and they're like, oh, we're so cheap. And like Rick said, you get what you pay for them. And we see something that's so ugly like that kind of exclusion, we won't ride with them.
We had a company come in and wanted to do a book roll. And
that means
move all of our business to them in one go.
Yeah.
And we were like, wow, you're like half the cost of this other book that y'all want to take. We're like, yeah, this looks good. We started reading the contract and started digging into it. And we absolutely said, we will not represent you at Ryan Insurance. This was so scary. The coverages, everything. It was.
Yeah.
It's asinine. It was bad.
We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
There you go.
But even though it was like half the cost of what we were selling, we couldn't.
You don't want to hurt your customer.
No.
All right. Well, if the customers want to get a hold of you guys and find out answers to their question, how they do it?
They can call us at 940-549-2525 or come visit us on the second floor of Sierra Bank Building.
Our office in Hudson Oaks is 817-770-0096, 2950 Fort Worth Highway, Suite 500.
If you're couch surfing, visit us online at brianins.com. That's Brian with a Y.
All right, guys, thank you very much for the information. We definitely needed it. All right, we got some great sponsors here from. We'll come back. We got your Wednesday helpline up, and today is a